All right. Well, welcome to the School of Faith podcast. My name is Chris Nye, and my guest today is Dr. Vince Bantu, who's joining us here. We at the School of Faith are a part of Awakening Church in the Silicon Valley. If you do not know us, we are in San Jose, California. And welcome. Thanks for listening and jumping in. My guest, Dr. Vince Bantu, is Assistant Professor of Church History and Black Church Studies at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California, where he serves as a liaison to the William E. Pannell Center for African American Church Studies and the network with African American churches, pastors, and students. Dr. Bantu earned his PhD at the Catholic University of America, and his dissertation married his interests in African Christianity and social identity. He's the author of some books and numerous articles, but the one I wanted to talk to you about today, Dr. Bantu, and the one I'm excited about is this book right here. It's called A Multitude of All Peoples, and the subtitle is Engaging Ancient Christianity's Global Identity. Dr. Bantu, this is one of my favorite books of last year. Really loved it. It helped me as a pastor engage with a lot of questions people have around the faith. I just gave kind of the credentials I found off of fuller.edu, but I'm curious, if you could just give us more of the background of who you are. Where'd you grow up? Did you grow up in the church? Who are you? Just would love to, get past the details of your biography and get to know you.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Thanks for having me on, Chris. Yeah. Well, I'm actually originally born and raised in St. Louis. So yeah, from the Lou, from the STL.
Yeah.
That's I did grow up in the church. Coming up, my family was kind of like mixed, in terms of like people being involved in church and not. Like coming up, as a kid, my dad wasn't around. I was a single parent household, and he wasn't, a believer, or nobody else in my family was, but my mom was a strong believer. And she, shared the gospel with me at a young age, and she always did it in a way that kind of put it like as like kind of a personal decision, like not trying to have it be just vicarious or anything. And so I really, remember kind of consciously making the decision to become a believer when I was really young, like maybe like 6-7 years old, and wanting to come to church. And, I approached my pastor to be baptized. And so I grew up really passionate about evangelism from a young age. And my church I grew up in was a, real like small conservative, real like strong, like kind of Bible church, like non-denominational, just focusing on evangelism. And yeah, so I was really involved in that in church, when I was coming up, but it wasn't like, it at the same time, it wasn't like just kind of, part of the culture around me, because most of my family members, other than my mom, were not really involved in church. And so it was really much kind of, and certainly like none of the people in my like West Side, neighborhood growing up in kind of an urban context. So it was definitely very much kind of like a conscious decision to really immerse myself in church.
Wow. And so where did higher education, how did that play into your story, coming up from that kind of background? It must be a long story or a long leap to go from being in church to getting a PhD in like Semitic languages and going into what you ended up going into. What was the Lord doing through that process?
Yeah, that was like really connected actually to my experience in church, because like, it was really it was really like it's really kind of growing up, church was always like, I kind of, saw it as like a place of refuge, and, a place where I could really be safe. I grew up in a community where I often really felt kind of unsafe, and being a Christian and being really committed to trying to live a Christian lifestyle was kind of rare, in my context. And so, I always kind of wrestled with how to be a Christian, but in a way that's fully me, because the church that I grew up in, wasn't really, I mean, it was great people, they loved the Lord, but it wasn't a lot of people that looked like me that were present in the church, or that, kind of acted or sounded or talked like me and like my neighborhood that I grew up in. And I was always feeling like there was a disconnect between who I was and who I grew up around, and then like my church, and kind of what being a Christian was presented and what that kind of looked like. So I always felt like it was a disconnect. And I remember even trying to bring friends to church, and they'd be like, "Nah, man, I'm good." Like, and again, it wasn't like anything overt, but it was just, I think, a lot of indirect messages being sent that to be a Christian means like to just completely change who you are, culturally speaking. And I was always kind of just felt stuck with that. And I honestly kind of felt like that, well, that's just how it is. And I just need to do that as well. And, we just need to kind of assimilate culturally. And I just kind of put that on myself as well. And when I felt called to ministry, and so I immediately wanted to go study. And I was like, man, I want to go study so I can, get more prepared and learn more about the Bible. And I think it was really even, I think in that experience also of like going into Christian college and seminary and studying theology and biblical studies, and again, not seeing myself reflected or seeing my community reflected in the curriculum or in the teachings. It was really concerning. And I think that was really when the Lord really spoke to me, and really just impressed it more deeply on my heart, that both in ministry context but also in academia, that there's a really strong need for people to see themselves reflected, and that's actually something that God desires. God doesn't want anybody, me or my community, from the west side of St. Louis, or anybody, to feel like they have to assimilate or change who they are in order to come to him in faith. But then in fact, like, a lot of who we are is made in his image, and is really a purpose. Like I had never really known that, and God really just spoke that to me through the word really powerfully at that time. And so, I think that was really where kind of the call to furthering my call into academics as well really came into play, where I really felt called to go into academics, but specifically, to learn more about the fuller history of the church and of Christian expression, and just how diverse and how inclusive and different and distinct Christian expression and theology and worship can really be. And really I just love learning about that myself, and then just be able to share it with the church, but also with the academy, and just to really hopefully try to give a more inclusive and diverse picture of Christian theology and church history in the classroom as well. Maybe hopefully a little bit better than what I had received at first. That's kind of hopefully the short version.
I could talk to you about that for another hour, man. That is so cool. And I think, just as an encouragement, I feel, just as I'm from Portland, I'm a white guy, like hearing your voice and seeing your scholarship was, if that was your intent to really share what you've learned, I just think you've done a great job through this book, and it's become a huge help to me and been recommending it a lot. I think what your book does that's so interesting to me, and again, for those of you guys listening, this book is called A Multitude of All Peoples, and just a really accessible but scholarly book, very thoughtful and scholarly, but I don't think it's above anybody's head. I think you've written it really well. But you really, I think flipped the script in a great way. Of a lot of people see Christianity as it started in Europe in the year 1500. For a lot of us Protestants, it started in Europe by Germans in the Middle Ages or in the 1500s, and that's what Christianity is. That's its history. And with you going further back, the line that I think is, and correct me if I'm wrong, somewhat your thesis at the beginning of the book is Christianity is not becoming a global religion. It has always been a global religion. And the story is typically told, like I said, that it came from Europe, it was established in America, and then after its establishment in America, got exported to the global world, and now it's this global religion. Can you just speak to what is wrong with that story?
Yeah, that I think, I guess, that's a great question, Chris. I would say maybe two things that two issues that come up with that story, which is definitely the story that I got. I mean, it's kind of, like, again, nobody really says it as bluntly as you or I would say it now, but that's really what's being communicated. And it's kind of similar to what I was sharing earlier about how coming up, nobody in my church or in many churches told people, especially from certain cultures or certain colors or hues, that you need to change who you are and like, in order to be a Christian. But that's still communicated in various indirect ways, and it's kind of the same thing with this kind of narrative of Christian history. I mean, one way that it's told, I think, is that, and I see this, in all the time in various seminaries and divinity schools, that questions of like diversity or global church or kind of, yeah, just different cultural experiences in the church, like even in the classroom and seminaries, those kinds of questions or conversations don't come up until like you get into like modern history or modern theology classes or kind of 1800s and later, like the last 2 centuries. But those kind of words like global and diverse and multicultural, those words don't even pop up when you're talking about kind of like the core of your systematic theology classes or like the early church or medieval church history. So it really does lend to this narrative that you just laid out, that Christianity just kind of went along this Western trajectory through the Roman Empire and Western Europe, and then then the Reformation, and then coming over to North America, and then in the 18 and 1900s, then it went from the West to the rest. And we communicate that in a lot of different ways. And I think one problem with that is it's just not historically accurate, and it doesn't capture the fullness of church history, that the gospel, yes, went through Europe, but it also went east as well, and it also went south, and it went every direction. And there's so many different communities, that, I mean, I coming up, one of the goals of the book was to really try to, hopefully, like you said, like make it accessible, like full of information, but accessible enough that somebody could pick it up and in one shot could get, hopefully, my hope is that people would get introduced to maybe some names and some places in church history that are really pivotal and that are really important for certain parts of the world and for global church history, but maybe that people haven't heard of before. Like, even a non-church historian, even just a regular average Joe, has probably heard the name Martin Luther before, or has heard the name Thomas Aquinas, or has heard the name Jonathan Edwards. Like, we might not be able to tell you a whole lot about them, but everybody's heard their names. But there are so many. On the flip side, though, not only average Joe, but even many church historians or theologians have never even heard the names like Narsai or Walata Petros or Zara Yacob or Shenouda. And these names are just as pivotal and just as crucial as these other Western names. So the goal of the book is really to make these other names, these unsung heroes, more just household names, and even just kind of to introduce a lot of these names and places to people. And that's I think that's part of the, once we see that there's this fuller history, it shows that trajectory that we talked about is inaccurate. But more importantly, I would say the last thing about why it's problematic is that, again, it actually really exacerbates a really significant problem, because, as I was mentioning earlier, a lot of my passion for this book and really for my scholarship is really evangelistic, and it's really missional more than anything, more than academic. And to me, academics is just like a vehicle or just a mechanism in service of the gospel. And so, I think that one passion of mine, for example, is evangelism and apologetics and missions with different religious communities, especially like in my context, like in the Black community, but in other places as well, who, they have this perception that Christianity is like a Western, or what they'll say is like it's a white man's religion. And the narrative that we as believers tell will just exacerbate that perspective, and it often pushes people away from the gospel, and people will reject the gospel, but not on like theological or like even philosophical grounds, but on cultural grounds. Like, it's not like there's it's not like there's often an issue with the claims of Jesus or the claims of the Bible, or it's not often that people are atheists or have scientific objections, but it's often a cultural issue. Like, oh, that's a white man's religion. It's not a religion for my people. And again, the way we tell history often really just exacerbates that. And even if we do try to talk about, oh well, there's global, there's Christians, there's more Christians in Africa and Latin America and Asia than there are in the West, so that's not true. But then someone can always push back and say, well, yeah, but how did it get there? Like, how did it in recent history through colonialism and missions and globalization, like, and oftentimes even when we look at global Christianity today, it's so often a Western Americanized version of Christianity that's often been kind of like shipped over into other cultural contexts, and so that can actually even exacerbate this dynamic that it was mediated through the West and it came from the West to the rest. And so I think that's why it can be damaging to really kind of tell the story in the way that we do, that we, I mean, I remember in church history class in college, the first time that I ever saw or heard a Black or brown person being mentioned in having to do with church history was in like maybe the last week of class when we talked about like modern Black theology. And so that can exacerbate that perspective and lead someone thinking that people of color had nothing to do with Christianity, at its foundations. And so that's really the purpose of the book, is just to fill in those, hopefully fill in some of those gaps.
Wow, so much to unpack there. Thank you. That's so helpful, and I think you've achieved it. I saw, in the start of your book, I was just reviewing it in prep for our talk, and really in a second reading of it, saw at the start of your book, you really setting up the role that politics kind of played in the early start with like Rome, and even just in how you were just talking about the way we tell the story. It's kind of been told the classic way history is told, which is through political powers, who was in power when. And I just wonder, as you have studied this so much, what are your reflections about the role of politics and church history and how that ends up kind of twisting the tale? Like, what do we have to be aware of? What do we have to combat against as we're currently living in historical moments, and thinking about how this time will be told, let alone how church history has been told? What role does politics in your mind play with how history is told in the church?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's definitely a factor that we have to always like kind of weigh and really consider when we're approaching certainly historical texts, because at a lot of these, for example, a lot of these councils that I talk about in the book, I mean, now, I don't want to reduce any of these theological debates that happen to merely kind of political debates that are just kind of masquerading as theological conversations. Like some people have made that argument, and I don't go there. I mean, I think a lot of the priests and the bishops and the monks who were on the various sides of these theological debates, whether it's Council of Nicaea or Council of Constantinople or Council of Chalcedon, or in some of the Persian councils, Synod of Bar Dadisho, or Synod of Ishak, or there's all these different councils that, I mean, I think there were real serious legitimate theological questions that people were deeply motivated, that people were getting it right, that faith and doctrine was being communicated in a way that was proper. But at the same time, so to me, it's not an either or, but it's a both and, that there were also questions of ethnicity and culture and identity that were at play in a lot of these conversations. And there was questions, as you said, of politics and of control. Like, I mean, some of these, a lot of these different councils, there, even the fact that, many of them were convened under the auspice of and kind of with the blessing of certain emperors, whether that was in the Roman Empire or the Persian Empire, and that they're, and a lot of the outcomes of them even involved military powers. Like, I focus a lot on the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and kind of the schism that entailed for so many Christians in different parts of the world. But there was the kind of the side that won out, so to speak, at least in the Roman Empire, Again, there are other parts of the world for which that council was really irrelevant in many ways, and they were kind of doing their own thing. But in the Roman Empire, that was kind of the dominant position, and so Christians like in Egypt or in Syria and Arabia that rejected that particular formula of the faith, they were severely persecuted, and not only by another faction of the church, but also that faction of the church that won the day had imperial backing, and there was financial and even military resources that were put at their disposal. And I talk about in the book how the Chalcedonian view, which was the dominant position in Rome, that became and still is the dominant position in much of Western Christendom, even after the Protestant Reformation. Most Protestants still will, kind of just without having really a dog in that fight and not having really explored that, because it's like 1500 years ago, we'll just kind of take the Chalcedonian definition. And even in many of our church history textbooks, we will often not even explore a lot of the communities that I'm looking at in this book, because precisely of their Christology that was not that was different, was at variance with the dominant kind of Roman position. But at that time, part of the tension, especially that developed in the 400s and 500s, was that the so-called Chalcedonian view, which was the dominant view in the Roman Empire, was trying to impose itself on many of the churches in North Africa and the Middle East that didn't accept that position. And there was even, attempts at really enforcing it, and bishops would come in to, some of these places, some of these from Constantinople or Rome would come in to North Africa or Middle East and say, hey, you better accept our formula of faith or we're going to kill you. And they were saying that with 100 Roman soldiers behind them. So, there was definitely, political and military, especially when I get into, in the book, especially as this tension grew, the Roman emperors became, exceedingly involved in trying to force kind of reconciliation or really kind of assimilation throughout the empire, especially, for example, Emperor Justinian in the 500s. He called for another council, the Second Council of Constantinople, in the mid 500s, and was trying to really kind of force kind of a uniform doctrine in the Roman Empire. And a lot of that was, especially for him as an emperor, it was much more politically motivated than it was theologically. He just was concerned about the Roman Empire having one dominant theology. Now, there were certainly, again, bishops and monks who were theologically motivated that the Miaphysite, so-called the one nature, kind of the other side of that Christology, got it wrong. So again, not everybody was pure. It wasn't like everyone was purely politics, but for sure that was definitely a part of it, especially when you look at the fact that some of these regions that from the dominant position were the rebels. In fact, I had to actually I didn't. Now I'm trying to be a fair professor, so I didn't like mark them down for this or anything. But I did read a paper the other day from a student that was like using this same kind of weaponized language that happens all the time, even in, again, modern church history textbooks. That a lot of these early Egyptian or Syrian so-called Monophysites, but they prefer to be called Miaphysites. Even in most of our like modern church history textbooks, will use this kind of language that, well, they were the rebels and they were the Roman church got it right. They were in a balanced position, and the other Christians, they were too far to one side or too far to the other. But the Roman church in the Council of Chalcedon had the perfectly blended theology and Christology. And then they'll use this weaponized terms like the rebels or the dissidents or the kind of the insurgents. And I caught a student of mine doing that in one of the papers too. And I was like, I was like, have you been listening in class? Like,
Yeah.
so I was like, hey, like, watch out for this. But I didn't grade him down for it, because I don't do that. Like, I don't grade people down for disagreeing with me, but I did have to keep it real. I did have to keep it 100 and be like, hey, like, I think we should watch stuff like that, because from their perspective, they were actually the Orthodox, and it was the Roman Church that were the heretics. And I wouldn't go in that direction either. But as you said, it kind of depends on who's writing the story.
Yes, yes. Well, let's tell the story correctly here for our listeners then, and what you do in this book so well is I think you explore a couple of regions that I would say are just underrepresented for sure, but also sometimes completely ignored in our history of the church. So like you said, the earliest most people can say is Rome, then Rome to Europe, then Europe to America. But some of the areas you explore, particularly Africa, North Africa, and Ethiopia, Egypt and Ethiopia, the Middle East and even beyond the Middle East into what you call the Silk Road and to Persia. Could you just help us understand? And again, considering some of the people listening, man, they have a very limited understanding of church history. What what was the story with those regions, and maybe highlight some of the importance of each of those regions? Because I was really struck particularly with the role of Ethiopia. That was a really cool exploration. I learned a ton of some of the theologians and writers that were there. So yeah, and also I probably missed an area or two, but those are the three that I think are often completely ignored: Africa, and the Middle East, and beyond to the Silk Road and Persia. But other places that you feel like, let's correct the story and let's highlight these areas.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I mean, I would say maybe, just two things, at least to start out. Like, in terms of correcting the story, again, I mean, and again, I mean, even if like folks, haven't done a whole lot of church history, I mean, I can just summarize it to say that, as I mentioned, this is the only kind of church history or date or anything that I guess I'd want to emphasize that I think is important is, as I mentioned just now, and a lot of folks may not know, but real quick. So the Council of Chalcedon was in the year 451, and that was a Roman church council, right? That was a kind of an empire-wide council in the Roman Empire, where they wanted to decide what is the best way to talk about Jesus being fully God and fully human. Now one thing I want everybody to be, I'll just say this really simply, like everybody, for the most part, almost everybody in the early church at that time believed, and most, almost all Christians still today believe that Jesus is fully God and fully human. So that was not really what the argument was about. The argument was about, how do we talk about that? How do we word
Yeah.
it? How do we phrase it in a way that captures, the fullness of divinity and fullness of humanity? Because all Christians believe Jesus was fully divine and fully human. Well, the Council of Chalcedon decided that the best way to talk about it or to word it was that he has one person. Jesus is one person, but he has two natures, two physis. So that's where you get this kind of language of diaphysite, or two natures, right? Well, many of the Christians in kind of the North and East Africa and the Middle East didn't really agree with that, and a lot of it was over language and terminology that didn't really make sense in some of their languages, especially when some of their bishops would translate that into other languages. It didn't really make sense. It sounded to them like the dominant kind of Roman Church was saying that there's two different Jesuses. Now, to be fair, that's not what the Roman Church was saying. Like the Bishop Leo, he wrote a famous tome, and that's not what he was saying, but that's how it was received. And so they rejected it and said, no, Jesus has one nature. Now, in the same token, the Western Church rejected much of the North and East African and Middle Eastern theology as well, and they also in turn misunderstood their theology and said, "Oh, well, you're saying he only had one nature, so you guys don't really believe Jesus was really human. You think he was only divine because you're saying one nature." That's not what they believe, though. That's not what they were saying, but that's how it was caricaturized at the time. And also the Western Church, centered in Constantinople and Rome, had more power. So all sides were really misunderstanding each other, but the side with more power won out. And again, to this day, this is still a very serious issue to this day. And many of us as Protestants in the US, it's like, oh, wait, why is this a big deal? And it might not feel like a big deal to us. But again, I just want to say that a lot of these churches that are surveyed in the book, many of them still have, they're still around today, and they still, their descendants are still, their traditions are still alive, and they are still written off often as being viable churches and being Orthodox churches, even by many Protestants who will sometimes read, again, even many church history textbooks that are written, they're oftentimes written by scholars who are kind of just writing in the same kind of Western bias that the bishops in the 400s had. And they'll say things that are inaccurate. They'll say things like, well, those Christians, they're not real Christians because they didn't believe Jesus was really human. That is not at all what they believe. But oftentimes in many of our church history textbooks, the label of heretic will be applied to these communities without actually even citing their theologians, because oftentimes their
Wow.
wrote in African and Asian languages that most Western scholars don't even read in. And so they won't even have read, theologians like Timothy Elarus or Dioscorus of Alexandria or Severus of Antioch or Benjamin of Alexandria or Philoxenus of Babu. They won't even have read or even know those names. But if you go read any of those names, none of those people I just named would ever say anything like Jesus was not really human. He was only divine. They completely believe that Jesus is fully God and fully human. Their argument, though, is that after the incarnation, that the humanity and divinity of Jesus were merged into one nature. That's why they say there's one nature. So the issue is not, the issue is like, is this whole language about one and two natures? And so those kind of sides separated. And again, though, that so I think that's one thing, is in terms of telling the story right, is that all of these sides in this debate were all Christians. And this isn't just me saying that, because there actually have been ecumenical statements that have been made by like Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox and some of these what are called Oriental Orthodox churches that are around today that have said similar things to what I'm saying right now, that basically like we were just kind of misunderstanding each other 1,500 years ago, and we're all Christians. We all believe in the gospel. We just kind of misunderstood each other. Like, that's not just me saying that. So I think that's one aspect of correcting the story, is that this is part of the household of faith. But then the other thing I'll say is that they also produce a lot of really rich and really great theology. I mean, there's so much to talk about, but maybe just to highlight, for example, like one example is one of my favorite theologians is Ephraim the Syrian. Ephraim the Syrian is a name that he is really not known, but he's one of the greatest and most prolific writers in the history of the church. But one of the reasons he's not known is because he wrote in a language called Syriac. And that's not a language that most even church historians know or work with. And so he didn't write in Greek and Latin like many of the other church fathers that we are more familiar with, John Chrysostom or Gregory of Nazianzus or some of these other people. But he wrote just as much. And one of the really cool things about Ephraim is that he was from an area called Orhoi or Edessa, and that's where the Syriac language was dominant. And he also did theology through the mechanism of poetry. And so he wrote theology, but in the form of poetry. And he wrote in the 4th century at the same time as some of the early kind of greats in the kind of the central Roman Empire. But by doing theology in the form of poetry, he was actually reshaping the narrative of how theology is done. And it was in a way that was a lot more relevant to his cultural context over there, which the form of poetry that he did, it wasn't just poetry like written, but it was actually an event. It was something that was lived and communal, and people all gathered around and heard these poems recited, and it was music and a choir, and it was just a very communal kind of thing. And he actually, this was a style of art that was from his native Syrian town of Orhoi, and he took that and used it to communicate the gospel and to teach people theology. And his writings are actually some of the considered the finest compositions of this uniquely Syrian poetic genre of literature and of art that in the history of that art form. And he's also a church father and one of the foundational theologians. So it's just I think a great example again of what I was talking about earlier about how just the flexibility, even in the earliest years of the church, of how Christians in different places found unique ways according to their own culture. And the other thing about Ephraim is that he also, and one way that he was distinct from a lot of the other more Western church fathers was that he had a very strong emphasis on nature and on creation and how God speaks through creation. And it's just as an example, like it's been really cool to like share about this whole kind of branch of church history, or these branches of church history, especially with the whole church, but especially with people groups like my own or others that have really been hurt by the church and traumatized by certain expressions of the church, to see that there has actually been like other examples of Christianity. Just as an example, like I've loved sharing about Ephraim and his whole kind of creation focus on church, and the way that he sees creation as something that's literally speaks. And that's been something that has really connected in opportunity. I've had the opportunity to teach, church history and theology in some Native American Christian schools and seminaries and contexts. And that's been something that I found is really connected with them, because many indigenous cultures also have a high value on the voice of creation and how creation speaks and engages with us. And that's something that hasn't really been a part of a lot of Western Christianity. And so oftentimes that, some of them have shared with me, that's something that an aspect of their culture that they haven't really been able to see as, how do we incorporate this, and how do we do this as Christians? Because the way Christianity was presented to us, like, it was very kind of oppressive, and it was also very westernized, and we didn't see that there was a place for this aspect, that they were almost at odds with each other. And so a lot of them have said, well, like, I really connect with Ephraim the Syrian and other early Syriac theologians. And this was like in the 300s. This was at the beginning, like at the foundational years of the church. And that there were people who again, embrace Christianity in ways that are unique to them. And I mean, last example I'll say that connects with my people is, especially, when we talk about traumatizing examples of kind of, Western Christendom, is, especially for people of African descent, the way that Jesus has been consistently portrayed looking like kind of like a Scandinavian person, or looking like a Northern European, right? That's been very theologically and psychologically traumatizing for many people, but especially for Black people, who have, on the flip side, been taught that Blackness is a sign of a curse, or is a sign of depravity in much of Western Christendom. And so when you mentioned Ethiopia, I mean, it's just so it's been so encouraging for me, but also for many, as I share a lot of this history in Black circles and Black Christian circles, to see some of the earliest paintings and manuscript drawings of angels and Jesus and Mary and biblical figures, all in Ethiopian manuscripts, looking Black, with Black skin and African hair. That's just a very empowering vision and visual aid to see that again, Ethiopia was a Christian nation since the 300s, and it's one of the oldest Christian nations in the world, and it freely adopted Christianity. There was no colonialism or slavery or anything like that. And it's actually, Ethiopia to this day is the only predominantly Black country that's never been colonized by a European power. And it's also a nation that's been a Christian nation and still is predominantly Christian since the 300s. And they have their own indigenous expression of Christianity that has its own worship and its own architecture and its own hierarchy and its own theological language. And it's completely, I mean, it's literally classified as an indigenous African religion. And so it's like, and again, like its own art expressions that, again, were drawn at a time when, even before and during the trans-Saharan slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade, when African bodies were being trafficked and as cargo and treated less than animals, and Blackness was seen as a depraved thing. That you have this beautiful tradition in Ethiopia that stands as a contrast to all of that celebrates Blackness and celebrates Black beauty, and also understands Jesus and Mary and angels to look like Black people and to reflect the beauty of Blackness, is also another, I think, encouraging example from these kind of untold stories.
So helpful, and I love that. We actually have a number of Ethiopian and Ethiopian American people in our church who are very familiar with Ethiopia's role in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and even educated me on a lot of that. So to read your deep history on it was so cool. In fact, I pulled this quote out. I think this might have been in your section on Ethiopia. You say, in the mid-4th century, the African churches, of Egypt and Ethiopia, upheld the doctrine of Jesus' divinity, while the ruler of the Roman Empire was attempting, unsuccessfully, to impose the belief that Jesus was a created being. This goes back to your thing about Christology, but I wanted to highlight it after what you said, because I think one thing that's important for us to learn as Christians is the way that the multi-ethnic and global church corrects one another and helps one another. And after reading your book, it got me thinking, man, without these people that you're celebrating, without the Ephraims and without the Ethiopian church and the Egyptian church and the churches in Syria and the Middle East, we would not be Orthodox without their work. And to ignore them would have been to ignore a healthy, holistic gospel that includes all nations, that Jesus came to preach the gospel to all nations and to send us out into all nations. And it truly became an all nations thing, but it underscored the deep importance of needing one another and needing the church in Rome needed the Ethiopian and Egyptian church to be orthodox. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that even in our present circumstance. You do a ton of teaching. You travel into different contexts, black churches, white churches, I'm sure all sorts of multi-ethnic and cultural churches. What do you feel like as I reflected on that quote from yours of like, what is that role even today for us in the body of Christ, and what can we do better? Where can we grow with some of that?
Yeah, that's a great example because just to flesh it out a little bit for the listeners, that was something that even in preparing the book that I wasn't really as aware of and was really encouraged to hear about. That as you mentioned, Chris, like in the fourth century, when Christianity came into Ethiopia and it was embraced by King Ezana, that was actually at a time of a lot of theological, especially in the Roman Empire, a lot of theological upheaval. And another reason why this was important to me is that one of the things that often gets said, especially by many non-Christian religious groups in the black community or in other contexts, is that Christian theology and doctrine was all just invented by Emperor Constantine, and Christianity just came out of the Roman Empire. And I that the aspect that you pointed to actually speaks to the contrast of that. Actually Constantine, and especially his son, almost kind of like normalized heresy. So
Yes.
and actually, to your point, that it was actually African theologians in the fourth century that were some of the strongest voices of orthodoxy. For folks that maybe haven't done a lot of church history, there was a group in the fourth century called Arians, and they believed that Jesus wasn't God. That he was like lesser than God, and that was a doctrine that at first, in the first kind of big Roman council, the Roman emperor agreed with the Orthodox Church and said, "Oh yeah, you're right. That's not right, and Jesus is God." And that wasn't the first time any Christian had said that, but it was the first time that in fact, it was the first time there was someone who was saying the opposite. And so therefore there was a council that needed to be called to kind of correct that. But then after that council, the Emperor Constantine kind of was wishy-washy on that. And he was actually persecuting African theologians like Athanasius, who was the Pope of Egypt, who was one of the foundational theologians who really argued strongly for the divinity of Christ against the Arians. That Constantine actually later was supporting Arians and was exiling Athanasius. And it was actually during one of his exiles when the emperor kicked him out of his position as the Pope of Egypt. It was during that time of kind of transition and chaos that actually after Constantine's, when his son took over, Constantius was the Roman emperor. He was a devout Arian, and he was really trying to push that and really impose that theology throughout the Roman Empire. Again, the theology of Jesus is not God. So, in the mid 300s in the Roman Empire, one of the most powerful empires in the world that had just allegedly kind of become Christian, the dominant, the leader was promoting a theology that said Jesus wasn't God, and he was continuing to exile Athanasius, who was the Pope of Egypt, and was trying to suppress his Orthodox teaching. And it was during that time that Ethiopia became a Christian nation. And so, that was through another story, through a Syrian missionary who came and evangelized the king of Ethiopia named Ezana, and he embraced Christianity. So when the Roman emperor heard about this, he was thinking like, oh, okay, Ethiopia just became, or it was actually called Axum or Agazi at that time. Okay, they just became Christian, and they're kind of to the south of Egypt. I'm having trouble controlling the Egyptian church because they believe Jesus is God, and I don't want them to believe that. So if I just heard that Ethiopia became Christian, so if I can kind of persuade them to embrace my brand of Christianity, that can kind of like team up on Egypt from both sides, from the south and the north, and kind of bring them into submission. But it didn't work. And the Ethiopian church rejected it and said, no, like, we believe Jesus is God. And in fact, some of the earliest inscriptions in the Ethiopian language called Ge'ez actually talk about Jesus being God. And so, and this is so pivotal because, again, these are some of the earliest African writings, period, like in sub-Saharan Africa. So some of the, and these are some of the earliest inscriptions in the Ethiopian language, which to this day is the only sub-Saharan African writing system in use. And so this is just shows how the not just like Christianity, but Orthodox, pure like gospel teaching Christianity is at the heart of African identity, and was written at a time when the Roman Empire was actually kind of being swayed by heresy. And in Egypt, as you mentioned, Egypt and Ethiopia were united in orthodoxy, and at that time, Africa was really leading in orthodoxy, whereas Europe was slipping into heresy. And so, it just, and again, like you said, we need each other. We all need each other back then, and we need each other today. And that's why we need to be talking and partnering with each other. But I think that, just a modern example of that ancient kind of example where you have, kind of now churches of African descent that I would say in many ways are more orthodox than many churches of European descent, I think are around like justice issues. I mean, we're living in a time today in the 21st century where, I think there are many people who are really rightfully crying out for justice, and we're looking for that to really come from the church, and as it should, because the Lord and the gospel and the scriptures call us to work for justice and to be agents of justice in this world, and to and to fight and strive for justice. But yet some of the loudest voices that speak against biblical values like social justice actually come from Christian leaders, especially many Anglo-American white evangelical Christian leaders will boldly say that things like social justice is not a part of the gospel, that the social justice is not the work of the church. And I'm sorry, but that's heretical. That's, yeah. I mean, when you look at the quality, when you look at how Jesus delineates the sheep from the goats, it has everything to do with social justice, and how you treat the most marginalized is a reflection of how you treat Jesus himself. But again, this is, and I'm not trying to romanticize. I think that that we in the Black church have a lot of growth, and it's not perfect by any means, but when it comes to that aspect, that's something that the Black church has consistently been a lot better at, is understanding the integral role of justice work in the gospel, whether it was fighting against slavery or segregation or lynchings or Jim Crow. The Black church is and always has been the greatest institution in the Black community, and has been at the center of justice movements and fighting for rights and empowerment for Black people. And there's been a lot more of a holistic kind of expression, and I get into this in my other book, Gospel Hymeno, but again, I think there's a lot of great things in like more like dominant culture or like white theology. But one of the things, especially I see this in the academy, but it filters into the church too, talking about this justice thing, is like there's kind of like this liberal conservative binary that is really a political and kind of a larger American dynamic, but it's filtered into a lot of white theology, that you have liberal and conservative theology. And I'm paraphrasing, and I'm kind of generalizing, but I think it's true in a lot of ways that, liberal Christian institutions strongly emphasize justice and equality and human rights, but there's not a lot of emphasis on like truth, and Jesus is the only way, and that biblical values and biblical morals and biblical standards are universal and are for all people. And then on the other hand, you have conservative thought, where there is a more of an emphasis on truth and biblical morals and personal ethics, but there's not a vision for justice, and that justice is a part of that. So you kind of like have these two camps in white seminaries and universities, and even denominations have split along these two lines. And really, in a way, the white church has kind of like took the gospel and like split it in two and kind of picked which half of it they're going to emphasize. But again, one of the ways that I think the Black church can be helpful and instructive to a lot of dominant white theology is the fact that you cannot separate those two things. You cannot separate the truth from justice. And that's I think another way, just like in the 4th century, that's a way that maybe the dominant voices of theology could really learn a thing or two from a lot of churches, Latinx churches and indigenous and African American churches. I think are usually a lot more orthodox on that particular point. Just as one example that came to mind.
It's so helpful, Dr. Bantu, and thank you so much. I feel like your book for me was a window into eschatology, even of like a window into one day. I pray, Lord, the deck will be shuffled and the truth will come to light, and we will see who's really the leaders of, the Christian history. And your example of what we're in today is so important for us to hear. Is that there's people in power right now, and there's theology that's in power right now, but that doesn't exactly mean that's going to be what's glorified in the new heavens and the new earth. That one day we will see the great reckoning of God's people, and we'll see who the leaders were, and we will know the names that you have in your book here, and we will know the stories correctly. And all the more reason for us today as Christians to engage with work like yours and so much important things. I'm wondering, just as we close, Dr. Bantu, where would you point people other than your amazing books? I know you have a great book actually coming out, or a chapter in Dr. Eric Mason's book on urban apologetics, which I'm looking forward to very much so. I think, is that the title of the book, Urban Apologetics?
That's right. Yeah. And that's a great collection of resources. I have one chapter in there that kind of addresses what's called the Kemetic movement. But there's, Dr. Mason himself has some great chapters in there on Hebrew Israelites, but that's going to be, that's going to be the go-to manual when it comes to, doing evangelism and apologetics in the Black community, in the urban Black context of like kind of interreligious communities. I mean, that's just, that is I think a fabulous resource. And then also I would say be on the lookout for another book that I'm working on, another edited volume, which is really kind of like meant to be a companion to A Multitude of All Peoples. Multitude of All Peoples is really meant to, again, like we said earlier, just kind of introduce people to like, hey, I'd like to introduce you to these unsung heroes in the church. And then my hope is that as people learn a little bit about these individuals, and they even get some quotations, that I put in the book, that people will want to go deeper and say, I want to read these people. Because as I mentioned earlier, some of this stuff is like some of the earliest just literature of any kind.
Wow.
Just Christian, but just literature, period. So this is pivotal for human history. I mean, like Shenouda, for example, was a theologian in the 4th and the 5th century in Egypt. And he's one of the first. He's not just one of the first, but he is the writer in the history of the Coptic language or Egyptian language. Well, the Egyptian language is like one of the oldest languages in the world. And I think it's so significant to just pause and think about the fact that in one of the oldest languages known to humanity, its single greatest writer was a Christian monk and theologian.
Wow.
And so, like, that it's just important. People should know his name for just human history. But I mean, certainly for church history and theology. And so my hope would be that as people get introduced, they'll want to go deeper and read some of these people. But the problem is that a lot of times, and as I teach and share this, people have said to me like, man, it's hard to get these writers, because that's part of the problem is that, again, I mean, you can go on your phone right now and you could, if you wanted to read the writings of Gregory of Nazianzus or John Chrysostom or Thomas Aquinas or Martin Luther, you could probably read their stuff, like most of it in English translation, just on your phone for free. But I mean, you can't even buy books for some of these African and Syrian and Asian theologians. Some of them haven't even been translated yet. So this other thing I'm working on now is meant to try to rectify that. And I'm actually co-editing a collected volume of all primary texts. And they're all like, African, Middle Eastern, and Asian language Christian theological texts that are all from like the pre-colonial period. So like the first 15 centuries of Christianity in China, Arabia, Georgia, Armenia, Persia, Egypt, Nubia, Ethiopia, like all these languages, some of which are even being translated for the first time, and all being put into one kind of big like anthology or one big book where it can just be a resource for people to just draw upon and read ancient, theologians from other perspectives in their own words and in their own writings in English and at an affordable price. So that'll be coming out with University of California Press, and COVID's slowing it down a little bit, but hopefully it should be out in the next couple of years. And that's another thing that I hope will be a blessing to the world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bantu. Again, guys, if you want to pick up his book, the book is called A Multitude of All Peoples. If you're at Awakening, I've posted about it a lot, quoted from it. And Dr. Bantu, thank you, man, for showing up and for giving us such a rich history lesson in such a short amount of time. I appreciate you coming through. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you.